good evening, everyone. Tonight we're going to look at early Christianity from the perspective not of the apostles, but the people who came after them. Some of these people were actually contemporary with the apostles, as we'll see. Many of them came long after the apostles. And a lot of them contributed to Christianity in very profound ways. We don't know so much about them because they're not in the Bible, so we don't hear so much about them, at least not in our community. But we can learn a great deal from them, from their lives, and from the contributions they made to the early church. I'm going to start off with an image that all Christians should be familiar with, the fish. And when I was younger, I often wondered how the fish symbol became so closely associated with Christianity. Well, I thought the loaves and the fishes, that's one connection, and the idea of the early disciples being fishermen, that was another connection. But there was a more profound and, in some ways, more interesting connection that I had been unaware of. Now, this is a picture of fish, an ancient picture. I think it's from the 1st or 2nd century AD. And there is an acrostic beneath it. Now, the acrostic actually spells the word ichthys in Greek, which means fish. But the letters, the words which make up that acrostic are very interesting. And they are Jesus Christ, God's Son, Saviour. And that little acrostic was something that the Christians came up with to identify themselves to each other during periods when it was not a good idea to advertise widely that you were a Christian. So that little acrostic comes from the statement, Jesus Christ, God's Son, Saviour. That was something that only a Christian would say. A pagan would never say it. A non-believing Jew or non-Christian Jew would certainly never say it. And taking the first letter of each word gives you the acrostic ichthys, which means fish. And that is the earliest symbol that was used by Christians to identify themselves. And you'll find the letters ichthys written around old Roman ruins, and you'll find sometimes just a very basic fish symbol scribbled down as well. And that is the connection of the fish with Christianity. Of course, Christianity wasn't originally called Christianity. It was originally called the Way. And we find that in Acts 9 verse 2, 19:9 and 23, and Acts 24, 14 and 22. And that designation of Christianity as the Way continued well into the 2nd century. Christians also called themselves Christians, and we know that from Acts 11:26, 26:28 and 1 Peter 4:16. So even in the 1st century AD, the Christians referred to themselves as Christians, but they referred to their belief as the Way. And the Way, of course, is a constant theme in Jesus' own message. I am the way, the truth and the life, and there is a way of life, there is a way of death, and the way is straight and narrow. So the Christians originally called their belief the Way, and they had this neat little acrostic to identify themselves to other Christians in a way that was safe to do so, and in a way that also affirmed a central belief of their community. And aside from the biblical writings of the 1st century period, there are many other writings which were produced, and one of the most interesting is called the Didache. The word Didache is a Greek word which means teaching. And this little document is generally dated between AD 50 to AD 90. Some historians push it out to the turn of the century, maybe just a few years after the start of the 2nd century, but no further for reasons I'll explain in a moment. The Didache is a fascinating document. It's like a cross between a moral guide, a statement of faith, and an ecclesial guide. So it tells you how to live a good Christian life. It gives you an idea of what Christians believe. And it also tells you how to organise certain things in the ecclesia. For example, it tells you how to prepare for a baptism, how to conduct a baptism, what to say at a baptism. It tells you how to run a memorial meeting. It tells you how to pray. It tells you what to say for the prayers for the bread and wine. And it also gives you instruction about signs of the coming of the end. Now, previously, until the 19th century, historians had only ever found references to the Didache in other ancient documents. No one had found a copy of this obscure little writing, and it was long believed to have been lost for good. But in 1873, an Orthodox an Orthodox church scholar, found it wedged between the pages of an ancient Bible. And it didn't take him long to realise what he had. And since then, some other copies have been found, such as this Coptic Greek copy from the Egyptian Christians. And people have been able to study it more closely. We have the full Didache. I've actually got copies of the Didache here tonight. I've got about half a dozen of them there if you want to look at them later. That's the Didache in modern English, so it's nice and easy to understand. So for various reasons then, it's believed to have been produced very early. One of the main reasons for that is that the Didache shows that it has deep Jewish roots. It was composed by a Christian community that appreciated and honoured the Jewish connection to Christianity. Some of them may have been Jewish Christians themselves. We know that because the first part of the Didache is called the Two Ways, and it's actually a document that predates Christianity. It's got a pre-Christian Jewish literary pattern, and it draws on Old Testament statements to frame the guidelines for the Christian moral life. It also draws from statements in the New Testament as well. So what we find then is that the Didache is a document produced by Christians who recognised that Christianity was part of a continuum that had begun with Judaism. Later Christians would deny this. Later Christians would say, no, Judaism is finished, it had its day, Christianity replaces Judaism, and the Jews no longer have a part in God's scheme. But the Christians who produced the Didache understood that there was an essential Jewish basis to Christianity, and that Christianity was the natural outworking of the Jewish belief system. So in many ways we can say Christianity was the second Jewish religion. Today, of course, we consider Christianity a Western religion, but it's not really. It's a Middle Eastern religion that conquered the West, and then the West conquered the world and started spreading Christianity all around the place. But really, Christianity is a Middle Eastern religion, and we need to remember that if we want to preserve its essential Jewish roots. Now, the Didache quotes the New Testament quite extensively, especially Matthew and the Epistles of Paul. And this shows that the writers of the Didache recognise these writings as authoritative. It especially quotes from Christ's Sermon on the Mount, and it takes some of Paul's pastoral and personal epistles and puts them to good use, giving instructions about how to run an ecclesia. So we get instruction on morality, fasting, baptism, ministry, and this kind of thing. The Didache also tells you what to do if someone comes to your ecclesia claiming to be a Christian and requesting hospitality. It tells you what to do if someone comes to your ecclesia claiming to be an apostle with the Holy Spirit. It tells you how to test them to see if that is true. And it also tells you how to differentiate yourself from the non-Christian Jews. One instruction it gives is to fast on alternate days to the Jews, so people won't confuse you with the Jews. And that was a necessary thing by this stage, because the Romans had a tendency to conflate the Christians and the Jews in ways which were awkward and offensive for both sides. And we might look at that a bit later. So the Didache is a fascinating glimpse into the way the early Christians were believing, preaching, organising their ecclesias. And one of the main reasons that historians are satisfied that it is an early document, one, it demonstrates that the Holy Spirit gifts were still active. Two, it makes immediate and extensive use of pre-Christian Jewish literature and the New Testament literature. 3, there is an indication that it's becoming harder to tell who's an apostle and who's not, which suggests the Holy Spirit gifts may be dying out now. So it's one of the reasons why some date it towards AD 90, maybe AD 100. But 4, the theology of the Didache is New Testament theology. There's no supernatural devil, there's no pre-existent Jesus, there's no Trinity, there's no hell, there's no heaven, there's no immortal soul. You could just about pick up the Didache and use it as a basis of faith and an ecclesial constitution today. That's how good it is. So that is a very refreshing find. And it actually caused a lot of scholars to completely revise their understanding of early Christian theology and realize that some of the developments which occurred later were very, very radical indeed. So this is a very reassuring document, a fascinating document that I urge you to become familiar with. And it was around this time that a guy called Clement of Rome lived. We're not quite sure when he was born, but we know he died around AD 100. Clement of Rome is not actually the Clement referred to in Scripture. He was another Clement. And around AD 96, he wrote an epistle to the Corinthian ecclesia. Clement was a bishop, a shepherd, as the New Testament word is. So he had authority to write to the Corinthians and advise them on issues that they were having trouble with. And the fascinating thing about Clement's epistle is that it looks almost exactly like an epistle out of the New Testament. It has the same theology, the same framework, the same style, and the same familiarity with the people he is writing to. Clement praises the Corinthians for their virtue and faith. He blames envy for the ecclesia's current problems, and we know that had been an ongoing issue in previous years. Clement refers to the martyrdom of Peter and Paul that helps us to date his epistle. So we know that this happened much, much later. He knows that Peter and Paul have died. So this helps us to date his letter around AD 96. He expresses hope in the resurrection. He says justification is by faith, not by works, following Paul. And he urges the Corinthians to keep the commandments of Christ. And again, there is nothing in the Epistle of Clement that we would not find preached and taught in our own ecclesias. He is an old school Christian, just like we are. Ignatius of Antioch, another guy who lived around this period. He lived from AD 35 to AD 107. Ignatius was a friend of another Christian we'll look at in a moment called Polycarp. And there's several lines of evidence that strongly indicate he was a student of John the Apostle, which is a really great link to the New Testament Christians. There was a persecution during the time of Ignatius under the Emperor Trajan, and Ignatius was arrested and sentenced to death for the heinous crime of being a Christian. He was transported to Rome, with a process which took some months, but that's public transport for you, and he was martyred there when he finally arrived. And tradition has it that he was thrown into the arena and torn apart by wild animals. But while he was on his way to Rome, he wrote 7 letters to different ecclesias and one to Polycarp, his friend. And these letters still survive, and they are very refreshing. Like the letter of Clement, they are New Testament in their doctrine and in their teaching. They indicate familiarity with the people he's writing to. They were personal friends. They are very encouraging. You could even read one out as an exhort today. Unfortunately, excuse me, in subsequent centuries, later Christians corrupted these letters. They took out some parts and wrote in ideas of their own to make his letters reflect their own theology. They were disappointed that Ignatius did not believe these beliefs which later became normative. So they changed his letters so that they reflected the later beliefs. And in addition to that, they wrote another 9 letters in his name forged to make him look more orthodox to much later Christians. And historians have gone through and worked out which letters are the forgeries and which are the originals, and with a bit of extra work you can get a good idea of the shape of the original 7 letters without the interpolations. And the epistles of Ignatius are very encouraging and again, absolutely kosher in the New Testament sense. Ignatius is the first person to refer to the church as Catholicos, which is a Greek word meaning universal. And that reminds us of the word Catholic, which is in fact where it comes from, which simply means universal. So there's this term going around by now, the universal church, the Catholicos church. Now, of course, the word has a very different connotation, but originally, at the time when Ignatius was using it, it simply meant the universal church, the church found everywhere. Ignatius was very firm about the responsibilities of shepherds in the ecclesia, and in his letters he emphasises the need to preserve and recognise those responsibilities so that bishops are not shamed or led astray by misconduct or lead their congregations astray. He says that he fears for church unity. He warns that Judaism cannot say. There's a bit of a resurgence of Judaism and Judaizing at this stage. And he urges resistance against false opinions and fables, as he calls them. One of the ideas he wrote against was a heresy called Docetism. Docetism was an ancient heresy which taught that Jesus was not really a flesh and blood human being, but some kind of incorporeal spirit being who merely pretended to be human and who never really died or rose again. And Ignatius says, no, this is absolutely not true. Jesus was a real flesh and blood human. He genuinely died and he genuinely rose again. And if you recall the words of the Apostle John, one of the things he warns against, he says, the spirit of Antichrist teaches that Christ is not come in the flesh. This is that same idea, Docetism, which had arisen even in John's time. And the fact that Ignatius combats it too indicates that they had been in the same area, that they knew each other, and that they were familiar with this idea. And they were doing their best to stamp it out. They are the 2 earliest references to Docetism which we have. And this idea of Docetism became quite popular in subsequent centuries as Gentile Christianity began to get a grip. The Emperor Nero played his own part in the development of Christianity. Nero lived from AD 37 to 68, and he reigned from AD 54 to 68. Nero is famous for 2 things. 1, the fact that he was utterly mental, and 2, the fact that he persecuted the Christians. Why did he persecute the Christians? Well, he said they were responsible for the Great Fire of Rome. We all heard the Great Fire of Rome. It was a great fire that happened in Rome. And the people in Rome didn't think it was that great. And this fire was massive. It was utterly catastrophic. Now, the Romans did actually have fire brigades. They had a well-organised fire brigade system. But the speed with which this fire broke out and the rapidity with which it spread absolutely overwhelmed them, and there was no containing it for a very long time. And the devastation was unbelievable. No one had seen anything like it. So, of course, when the official inquiry or whatever went into this thing, people were going, okay, well, how did this happen? And everyone's looking around trying to figure out how it happened. Nero said, I'll tell you how it happened. It was the Christians. The Christians started this fire. And no one was quite sure why the Christians had started this fire, but you don't argue with the emperor. And Nero said, look, you take it from me, the Christians started this fire. It's the kind of thing they would do. Now, that doesn't ring very true today from what we know of early Christians. I mean, they were a tiny minority group. They were absolutely microscopic. They were smaller than the Jewish community. It was almost impossible to call for the Christians to cause that kind of scale of trouble, even if they tried. But Nero had a number of reasons for blaming the Christians. The main one was that even among non-Christian Romans, there was a very strong suspicion that he'd started the fire himself. One theory that was doing the rounds at the time was that the fire had covered an area that Nero had hoped to claim under government mandate and redevelop. For various reasons, he'd been unable to get hold of it. I know, maybe council planning permission, you know how it is. For whatever reason, one theory was he couldn't get hold of this land and he needed it destroyed so he could claim it and then develop it himself. That was one theory. I don't know how much weight there is to it, but it's as good as any. And Roman writers living safely after the time of Nero uphold this theory, and they also say Nero blamed the Christians to take suspicion off himself. In fact, the Roman historian Tacitus says to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Well, hated for their abominations. What abominations could the early Christians possibly have been committing? We know from the New Testament that they were very virtuous people. We know even from the grudging reports of some of their early enemies that you were hard-pressed to find reasons to be angry at the Christians. So what possible abominations could they have been up to? Well, there are a number of reasons for growing Roman antagonism towards the Christians. Firstly, the Christians refused to pay the Jewish tax, the fiscus judaicus. And as I said before, the Christians in the early days were often lumped together with the Jews. Romans couldn't really see much difference. A lot of the Jews were still worshipping at synagogues. They confessed to believe in the same God as the Jews. They were monotheists. Many of them still fasted. Some maintained the Jewish dietary laws. And the Romans said, it's all too hard. You're just another type of Jew, really. The Christians said, okay, that's a bit racist, but you know, and Romans said, well, you're going to pay the Jewish tax. And the Christians said, no. So they absolutely refused to pay it. And that was a major, major problem for the Romans. And it wasn't until the end of the first century that legislation was finally changed so that only those who openly practiced Judaism were required to pay the Jewish tax. And the Christians said, see, we told you so. Well, the Christians, though, also were considered atheists because they only believed in one God. And the Romans, who had a vast and impressive suite of gods, and who found it hard enough to believe that the Jews only believed in one God, were perplexed that another bunch of people were also only believing in one God. And they said, okay, believing in only one God is as good as believing in none. So as far as we're concerned, you are atheists. And we all know what a threat atheists are to civil society, so you must be a real danger. Also, too, the Christians had a legacy of civil disobedience. They refused to swear oaths. They refused to serve in the military. And they refused to honour the emperor. In the early days, you were required to offer sacrifices to the emperor. The emperor god, as he was known. There was a cult of emperor worship at this time. And he was supposed to revere the emperor as if he was a god. Under the Roman system, he was considered a sort of a demigod. He was the father of the nation. The whole system would not work unless the emperor was venerated. And the Romans first demanded that the Christians sacrifice to the emperor, and the Christians refused to do that. And the Romans said, okay, maybe just even swear oaths to the emperor, and the Christians refused to do that. Finally, the Romans, sounding increasingly desperate at this stage, said, all we require is that you burn incense to the emperor. And the Christians still refused to do that. So it was about that stage that the Romans started killing the Christians, because they said, okay, you people are completely unreasonable. During this time, actually, you could prove your loyalty by sacrificing or swearing an oath to the emperor or burning incense, and you would get a certificate to prove that you had done it. So the next time someone comes to your house saying, oh, how about the emperor? Oh yeah, my certificate. Oh, okay, right you are. And a lot of Christians who weren't quite so solid in their faith found ways of obtaining forged certificates or genuine certificates sold on the black market, which got them out of this. It was quite well documented. And other Christians simply maintained their scruples and suffered for it. The other thing too was that Christians evangelized vigorously. The Romans didn't like the Jews very much, but they said, at least they don't shove their religion down your throat. They keep it to yourselves. And the Jews said, of course we do. In the last few thousand years, people keep invading us. What do you expect we're going to do? We've learned the lesson. But Christians hadn't picked up on this. Christians went out in there and, it wasn't just that they didn't believe in your gods. They went around telling people that you had to believe in their God. Or, the Romans didn't like that. It was one thing not to believe in other people's gods. You didn't deny their existence, though. That was rude. But the Christians denied the existence of other people's gods. And they said you had to believe in their God. Now, the Romans didn't like this at all. This was highly offensive. So, at any given moment, the Christians would come along and evangelize at you. Pagans didn't evangelize, and the Jews didn't evangelize. But the Christians went running around broadcasting their religion at everybody, and the Romans didn't like that at all. It was very destabilizing to civil society. And the Romans came to believe that any calamity which came upon the empire was the result of losing favour with the gods. And they thought, well, because we haven't kept these Christians in check, our gods are frustrated. These people are running around insulting our gods, and we haven't done enough to stamp them out, so we're getting punished by the gods. So hopefully if we stamp out the Christians, then our gods will be happier with us. We can get this thing sorted out. So no matter what natural disaster occurred, they would say, it must be the Christians' fault. In fact, a much later Christian said, whenever the Tiber floods or the rain fails to come, the cry goes up, the Christians to the lion. What, all the Christians to one lion? He was quite sarcastic to the lion. So the Romans now had good ideological reasons for persecuting the Christians. And finally, Christians had a new religion. And it's very difficult for us in the modern age to appreciate what a dangerous thing that was. In the ancient world, the logic goes, old is original, original is true. A new religion or a new philosophy is viewed with great suspicion, cannot possibly be true. If it was true, why haven't people been believing it before? Now, the Greeks were a little more open-minded about this sort of thing. You go to Mars Hill and you get new ideas and everything. That's great. The Romans, though, were very conservative people, ideologically speaking. And they didn't like this idea of running around spreading new ideas. And they didn't like the idea of new religions. Oh, I had a sneaking suspicion that the Greeks were laughing about them behind their backs, which they probably were. But the Jews, the Jews they respected. The Jews were irritating people, but they had a very old religion that went back to who knows when. So the Romans had this grudging admiration for the Jews. They had a very old religion. And they seemed unkillable, which was pretty impressive. And the Christians come along and they got a new religion. So you'd been minding your own business in the square, and some people would come up to you, let's talk about our beliefs. Oh yeah, fair enough. Can we talk to you about our religion? Yes, sure, why not? Okay, well we've got a new religion. You've got a what? Sorry? Oh yeah, it started about 80 years ago. What? That's not a religion. That's a hobby. The ancients found it very difficult to understand the idea of a new religion that was also legitimate. So Christians were viewed with suspicion because they were coming up with new ideas, dodgy ideas, dangerous ideas that destabilized the nation and undermined society. So martyrdom followed immediately. It became necessary to stamp these people out, to prove to the gods that Roman society did not approve of the Christians. And the Roman historian Tacitus says, mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. New and inventive ways of killing people were developed specifically to get rid of Christians. The trouble was that killing Christians had the opposite effect. Over time, Romans became desensitized to the killing of Christians and then started to become sympathetic to the Christians. There was no history of martyrdom in the pagan system. There was in the Jewish system. The Jews had a long history of martyrdom. It was what they were good at. But the pagans had no such system. And when they saw Christians dying for their beliefs, they were deeply moved after a while. They began to realize maybe there's something in this. Martyrdom proved Christian society. It earned non-Christian sympathy, and it won converts, and incredibly, it raised Christian morale as the community grew. So Romans soon began to discover that unless you were very careful, martyrdom and killing Christians only made these people grow. And another famous martyr of the early Christian period was a guy called Polycarp of Smyrna. He was the Bishop of Smyrna, which is in Turkey. He lived between AD 69 and 166. He was contemporary with another guy we'll look at in a moment called Papias, also with Ignatius, his friend, and John the Apostle. He wrote an epistle to the Philippian ecclesia, and he was martyred under one of the emperors. It was either Marcus Aurelius or Antonius Pius. And Polycarp was a very old man when he was finally arrested. He was in his 80s or 90s, depending on which calculation you accept. His friends moved him around for a while to evade arrest, but eventually, late at night, he was cornered in his friend's house, and a bunch of Roman soldiers came in and said, "The game's up, Polycarp, we're arresting you." And Polycarp said, "Okay, that's fine. By the way, we're about to have supper. Would you like to have supper with us?" And the Roman soldiers thought, "Okay, it's a bit weird. But okay, yeah." So, "Okay, well, we'll sit down and have supper." So Polycarp sat down with his mates and had supper with the Roman soldiers. The soldiers go, "Okay, pass the wine." And after the meal, Polycarp said, "Oh, do you mind if I have a few moments to pray in the next room?" And the soldier said, "Okay, yeah, that's a bit weird. Fine, go ahead." So Polycarp went off to his room with some friends, and they prayed for a little while, and then they came out, and Polycarp said, "Okay, take me away." Romans, very disturbed by this. People didn't do this normally. There was the kicking, the screaming, the shrieking, the jumping out windows. Polycarp was giving up, and it was bizarre. And they'd never seen anything so powerful and so faithful and resolute as the witness of this old man. So they dragged him into the arena, and thousands of Romans looking down at this little old man in the middle of the arena. And he was told to swear the oath to Caesar, and he said, "No, 86 years have I served Christ, and he has never wronged me." Okay. So they then said, "Well, Polycarp, if you don't swear an oath to Caesar, we'll unleash the wild beasts," and you know how that goes. And Polycarp said, "Let them come. I cannot change from good to bad." So now you had the bizarre spectacle of a little old man defying the Roman Empire in the middle of an arena. And due to the fact that old age was very greatly respected in those days, this was increasingly a very bad look. It was not a good look to go around killing really old people, especially if they were respected in their community. And people found this quite unsettling. Polycarp was actually eventually burned to death in the arena, but it left a very bad taste in the mouths of the Roman populace. They realised something bizarre and disturbing had happened here, and the Romans started to think much more carefully about this weird message that the Christians had that made them so amazingly devoted. So Polycarp's witness was very, very powerful. It was one of the reasons why the Romans and other Gentiles began to think twice about Christianity. Papias of Hierapolis, he lived, well, we don't know when he was born, but he died around 166. And this picture is an ancient theatre at Hierapolis, which is in southwestern Turkey, where Papias lived. We know he was born before AD 70, and we know that he received an oral tradition of the apostolic teachings. He spoke to people who had known the apostles, and he got their teaching straight from them. And even in his writings, he said, "I sought out those who'd known the apostles because I wanted to hear directly from them rather than from writings." He said, "I preferred the living word." He was contemporary with the Apostle John and Polycarp. It's likely he received some instruction from Polycarp. And he was martyred under the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Papias wrote a 5-volume commentary on the sayings of Christ, but today we've only got a few tiny fragments left. No one thought it necessary to preserve them until it was too late. But from his writings, we know that Papias believed in the resurrection, the judgment, and the literal 1,000-year reign of Christ. His beliefs were completely consistent with all the other Christians we have seen. Papias also tells us that Mark knew Peter and that they spoke together while Mark was composing his gospel. And there's a lovely little quote from Papias in one of the fragments of his writings. In the days of the kingdom, the just man who is on the earth shall forget to die. As Christianity spread throughout the empire, it became a victim of its own success because it spread far beyond its Jewish roots into Gentile territory. And by the 2nd century, we now have the rise of Gentile Christianity. Gentile Christianity is where it all starts to go wrong. This is Marcion of Sinope. He lived from AD 85 to 160. He was originally a Christian. It's possible he was even an ecclesial leader in Sinope. And he joined the Roman ecclesia. He was very rich and he made a very generous donation to the ecclesia when he joined. Later, he began to believe some pretty weird stuff and started preaching quite heavily. So he was excommunicated from the ecclesia. He was disfellowshipped. And to make sure that no one could accuse them of taking advantage of Marcion, the ecclesia returned every penny that he had given them. So after Marcion was kicked out of Rome, he went back to Asia Minor and he established his own little belief system with his own group. Marcion believed that there was no connection between Jesus Christ and the Old Testament. And he subscribed to docetism, the idea that Jesus was some kind of incorporeal spiritual being, not a flesh and blood human. He believed that there were two gods, that there was a supreme loving God of the New Testament, introduced to us by Jesus, and an inferior, wrathful, evil God of the Old Testament. And rather than accepting the books that we know today as the New Testament, he defined his own canon, which consisted of what he called the Epistle of Christ, which was simply 10 heavily edited chapters from Luke, and another book he called the Apostolicon, which was 10 Pauline epistles, also edited by Marcion to fit his beliefs. He rejected the Old Testament wholesale, and he rejected all the other New Testament books. At this stage, this early stage, the Christians did not have a full New Testament canon. The New Testament documents had not been fully distributed throughout the Roman Empire. Marcion was the first to come up with the idea of a New Testament canon. The idea of a canon, of course, had been established by the Jews. The Christians did not yet have a canon of their own. And Marcion's decision to create his own canon prompted Christians to do likewise. So there became this precipitated a scramble to decide which writings were authoritative and which were not. This became increasingly important because now some pretty weird literature was floating around the place. One of these was called the Epistle of Barnabas, which was written somewhere between AD 90 and 135. It makes extensive use of the Old Testament, but there's only one clear New Testament reference, and there's no knowledge of the epistles. And whoever wrote it, who definitely was not Barnabas, takes a very negative view of the Jews. He says the Jews were rejected at Sinai, God's covenant was with Christians alone, the law was purely symbolic, was never meant to be kept literally, and that the Jews misinterpreted the law of the prophets because they were deceived by an evil angel. So he has this very negative view of the Jews, and he had some bizarre ideas, and it's the first writing we find in which the pre-existence of Jesus is openly affirmed. And of course there were other odd writings kicking around the place at this time. The Shepherd of Hermas, the Gospel of the Egyptians, Second Clement, which was definitely not written by Clement, Gospel of Basilides, Apocalypse of Peter, Acts of Andrew. You want to know what Andrew got up to in his spare time? Well, you won't get it from the Acts of Andrew. Traditions of Matthias, and the Gospel of Thomas. So all of these weird documents, a mixture of Gentile philosophy and random scraps of Christianity that hadn't fully percolated through the empire, were just floating around the place and causing a great deal of confusion. We've got to remember that literature travelled very slowly through the empire. Only 10% of the Roman population could even read, let alone write. So it was very easy for people to be confused or misled. And it helps to explain why Christianity fragmented as quickly and as deeply as it did. What was the empire doing around this time? Well, the Emperor Trajan, AD 53 to 117, reigned AD 98 to 117, had to deal with the Christians himself. And the Christian problem was brought to his attention by a local governor called Pliny. And Pliny wrote to Trajan and said, look, we've got this weird cult going on. You know how it is. We've just had a turn of the century. All the crazies come out. And there's this new bunch called the Christians. I won't even tell you what they believe, but they're pretty disturbing people. And I've got to say, I've been doing my best with them. He says, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I've observed the following procedure. I interrogated them whether they were Christians. Interrogation in Roman context always means torture. And if they confessed it, I repeated the question twice again, adding the threat of capital punishment. If they still persevered, I ordered them to be executed. So Pliny would find some people who'd been accused of being Christians. He would arrest them and say, hey, are you a Christian? Yes, I'm absolutely a Christian. Okay, well, we're executing Christians at the moment. Are you sure you're a Christian? I've been having these doubts recently. So the Emperor Trajan replied to Pliny. This is an excerpt from his reply. You observed proper procedure, my dear Pliny, in sifting the cases of those who had been denounced to you as Christians. They are not to be sought out. If they are denounced and proved guilty, they are to be punished, with this reservation, that whoever denies he is a Christian and really proves it, that is, by worshipping our gods, even though he was under suspicion in the past, he shall obtain pardon through repentance. But anonymously posted accusations ought to have no place in any prosecution, for this is both a dangerous kind of precedent and out of keeping with the spirit of our age. There's a surprisingly progressive view there by Trajan. He's not interested in anonymous accusations, because that kind of thing can snowball very quickly and lead to civil unrest. He says if they are denounced and found guilty and they confess and they refuse to worship our gods, then you can treat them as you wish. But this persecution was not a big persecution. It was localized, only within Pliny's area. So it affected a number of Christians, but it was not some kind of universal official persecution of all Christians. It was just sorting out a little local difficulty. How did the early Christians view Christ? This is one of the earliest depictions we have of Jesus. And it's from the early 2nd century, Christ as Good Shepherd. It's from one of the catacombs in Rome. There's some very interesting features of this picture. Firstly, we know that the artist was not a Jewish Christian because he would not have depicted any living creature. Jewish Christians retained a lot of the conservative values of the Jewish community. They did not dare to produce artwork in any form, really. And certainly they would not have produced a picture of a living being. Also, notice how normal Jesus looks in comparison to much later depictions that you may have seen. He's tanned from being outside, like a shepherd would be. He's wearing the tunic, which was the briefest form of costume you could get away with in Roman society. And it was only worn in public by two classes of people, soldiers or manual workers, which a shepherd was. And there's no attempt here to deify or glorify Jesus. He is depicted as someone who's just as human as we are. You may not be able to tell he's got heavy sandals on, as a shepherd would have. And again, you can't tell terribly well from this distance, but he's actually looking directly at the viewer, and that's significant. Places his eyes on the same level as yours. and that would all change in later centuries. So the picture aims at realism, and above all, it aims at a Jesus we can relate to. His clothing is basic and practical. The hem is far above the knee. Again, a Jewish man would never show his legs in public. So this is done by a Gentile Christian who has no such scruples, and who depicts Jesus as he believes he probably would have looked at in his own society. And it's a very real Jesus, a Jesus who is comfortable outdoors, doing what shepherds do, a Jesus who lives and practices what he preaches, who's loved by humans and animals, and a Jesus who cares for you. That is a very profound, very powerful piece of artwork. And later Christian artwork was nothing like that. That is Jesus to the early Christians of the late 1st century, early 2nd century. But a lot of other people did not take that same view. Valentinus was a famous heretic who came up with a system of belief called Gnosticism. Gnosticism does not predate Christianity. Gnosticism arose in the early 2nd century from within the Christian community. It was a mystical belief system which wove Greek ideas, pagan ideas, Roman ideas with Christian ideas. Valentinus claimed that he'd been taught by a fellow Gnostic called Theudas, and he said Theudas had been instructed by the Apostle Paul, and he'd passed on secret knowledge that had come down through Jesus that had somehow bypassed everybody else. So Gnosticism became associated with the idea of secret knowledge. And of course the Christians said, well, hang on, Gnostics, there is no secret knowledge. We've got all the sayings of Jesus, and we know the people who came after him and the apostles. There's nothing that's secret. We already have these teachings. So what more can we know? And the Gnostic says, we can't tell you. It's a secret. But if you join, we'll tell you. And Chris says, well, what? And the Gnostic says, it's very complicated. And so anyway, so there's huge controversy between the Gnostics and the Christians. Gnosticism persisted for a couple of centuries as a threat to the Christian community. But it was never a copy of Christianity. Didn't have the same social network, and it didn't have that same openness. Gnosticism was a secret society that you could join to be like all the cool kids who enjoyed telling you that you didn't know what they knew. So the Gnostics went off in their clubhouses and basically threw stones at people from a safe distance, which nobody really appreciated. Once we get deeper into the 2nd century, we come across guys like Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr lived AD 103 to 165. He was born in Samaria to Greek or Roman parents, and he studied the works of various philosophers, but he was unsatisfied by them. He wanted something deeper. And one day he was walking on the beach in the morning, and then a guy who called himself a Christian. And this Christian talked to him about the Old Testament, and he expounded the Old Testament messianic prophecies to him. And Justin had never heard anything like this, and he was deeply convicted by the power of this message. And this Christian converted Justin to Christianity. And he founded a school, a theological school, at which some other famous Christians later studied. But Justin Martyr, being a very philosophical guy, saw Christianity as the highest form of philosophy. So he saw no problem interpreting Christianity and Scripture through the lens of pagan philosophy. And he came up with a perverted form of Christianity which had many pagan elements. So he believed that Jesus pre-existed as a divine being, but not God. Nevertheless, he admits in his writings that he knows of other Christians who do not accept this belief, and he recognizes that their belief is the older one, the original teaching. He considers them Christians as well. He doesn't have a beef with them, but he understands that his view is a more modern view, although he thinks he's simply more enlightened. Justin Martyr, as you'll see in, or you should see in the picture that's on here. There he is. He continued to wear his philosopher's robe even after he became a Christian, and he considered himself a philosopher Christian. But he did have some vestiges of the true Christian message. He says, if you have fallen in with some who are called Christians, who say there is no resurrection of the dead, and that their souls when they die are taken to heaven, do not imagine that they are Christians. But I and others, who are right-minded Christians on all points, are assured that there will be a resurrection of the dead, and 1,000 years in Jerusalem, which will then be built, adorned, and enlarged, as the prophets Ezekiel and Isaiah and others declare. So in many respects, Justin had the right message, but there were a few ideas that he went astray on. Nevertheless, no immortal soul, resurrection of the dead, judgment, 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, kingdom of God. All those ideas were central to his belief, and he called that the rule of faith, the touchstone of orthodoxy. How were early Christians living? We don't get much of a picture of that from the New Testament. The vast majority of people in the Roman Empire, certainly in the urban areas, lived in the apartment building called the insula. The Romans invented the apartment building, and generations of town planners have never forgiven them for it. Roman apartment buildings could be up to 7 stories high, which was pretty impressive for those days. And most people could not afford to live in anything better. The size of an apartment in the insula could be as small as 25 square metres, with a maximum of 2 rooms. Normally they were between 25 to 45 maximum. 2 rooms, 45 square metres. That's your lot for a family. And only the ground floor apartments had plumbing. The higher up you went, of course, there was no way to get the pressure. So residents on higher floors had to rely on outside water sources. They had to go all the way down to the bottom to a public fountain and bring water up in buckets. It also meant that the higher you were, the greater your fire danger. So if this is how most people lived, where did the Christians meet for their memorials? Well, we know from the New Testament that they hired upper rooms in other places like inns, etc. But also they met in the larger houses of wealthier Christians. The larger house was called the domus, upper class house. And this was an expensive freestanding house. Now the average size of a domus in the Roman city of Pompeii was 270 square metres. And that compares very favourably with the average Australian house, which is only about 243 square metres. Some of these things could be up to 450 square metres. But that's a standard domus, about 270 square metres in Pompeii, for example. And there were a number of features of that domus that made it ideal for Christian meetings. Firstly, the atrium, which was the central hall, a wide open space where you could gather a large number of people. In the middle, there was an open part of the roof with slanted gutters pouring water down into a pool right in the centre. And that pool was called the impluvium, and it guaranteed a fresh, free internal water supply that could be used for light refreshment, for light washing if necessary, and during the summer months it would slowly evaporate, which would have an evaporative cooling effect through the house. Also too, Christians came to baptise their fellow Christians in the impluvium, since it was about 30 centimetres deep, which was easily enough for a baptism. And the atrium could hold literally dozens of people at one time, so it was ideal for memorial meetings. Just behind the atrium was the tablinum. The tablinum was the home office. This is where the head of the household did all his business. He conducted business with friends, with clients. He entertained privileged guests there. This was where all the household documents were kept, financial accounts, family records and archives. And the long curtains allowed you to seal it off from the atrium. Beyond this was the peristylium, an external courtyard. This could be used as overflow seating in case you had a large congregation. And over time it became common for the baptized Christians to take the bread and wine in the atrium, and those who were unbaptized just sat further back in the peristylium where they could still join in, but it was more efficient. It meant you could easily distribute the bread and the wine to people who were baptized, whereas those who weren't would sit back here and who could still participate without being in the atrium. The triclinium was a dining room just off to the side of the atrium, and it was often positioned in such a way that if you were in the atrium, you could see the people in the triclinium. And a domus usually had 2 or 3, maybe as many as 4 of these. And this is where the most privileged guests were entertained at dinner. You would lie down on the couches, usually 3 people to a couch, and the table of food was closest to whoever was highest in the pecking order, and slaves served you. But if you were lower in the pecking order, you had to sit in the atrium, and you were all shoved together on a long bench, and you were served inferior food. And this is the situation that's described in 1 Corinthians, when there were large banquets or big meals being held by the ecclesia. The lower class Christians who arrived late, because they had to work, were herded into the atrium, and they were forced to sit down up to 40 at a time on long benches, eating leftovers and inferior food and wine which was mixed with bitter herbs. Whereas the upper class Christians entertained each other in the triclinium in full view of their brothers and sisters. This was a pagan custom, a Roman custom that the Christians had preserved, the Corinthian Christians. It was a terrible form of discrimination, and Paul rails against it in 1 Corinthians 11. That is what's going on here. I'll leave you with an account of a Sunday memorial written by Justin Martyr. This is a 4th century mosaic in a church at Tabgha in Galilee. Tabgha is believed to be the place where Jesus performed the miracle of the loaves and fishes. And this is an account of the Christian memorial meeting by Justin Martyr, early 2nd century. The memorial meeting in these days, of course, was called the Eucharist, which is a Greek word from the Greek word Eucharista, meaning thanksgiving. Paul refers to the memorial as the thanksgiving in his own writings. James, I think, refers to the memorial as the love feast. And in the 1st century, Eucharist and love feast were common terms for the memorial meeting. And this is Justin Martyr's account of what happens in his ecclesia on a Sunday. On the day called Sunday, all who live in cities or in the country gather together to one place, and the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read, as long as time permits. Then, when the reader has ceased, the president verbally instructs and exhorts to the imitation of these good things. Then we all rise together and pray, and as we before said, when our prayer is ended, bread and wine and water are brought, and the president in like manner offers prayers and thanksgivings according to his ability, and the people assent, saying, Amen. And there is a distribution to each, and a participation of that over which thanks have been given, and to those who are absent, a portion is sent by the deacons. And they who are well-to-do and willing give what each thinks fit, and what is collected is deposited with the president, who succours the orphans and the widows, and those who, through sickness or any other cause, are in want, and those who are in bonds, and the strangers sojourning among us, and, in a word, takes care of all who are in need. And even though Justin himself had some odd ideas which don't mesh with 1st century Christianity, we can see that the original Christian tradition of the memorial meeting had been firmly established and was being kept faithfully in a way that is remarkably similar to our own memorials today. The presence of water at the memorial meeting was not uncommon. It was typical for people to water down their wine, particularly the Christians with still the legacy of the Jewish background. The Jews tended to water down their wine. The Romans a little bit too, the Greeks not so much. They enjoyed it too much. But also too, the Christians wished to avoid any accusations of impropriety. So watering down the wine proved that you were not drinking the wine for the sake of the wine. It proved you were drinking the wine for more ceremonial purposes and you weren't there to get drunk. So this is a little glimpse into the early ecclesias and the lives of the early Christians. And next week we'll look a bit further into the way that Christianity began to change as the empire began to adopt it.